Welcome to the Recovery Cast, brought to you by Hills and Ranges Private.
Welcome to the Recovery Cast, brought to you by Hills and Ranges Private. My name is Alexis, and I am a former alcoholic and addict now in recovery. The Recovery Cast is a podcast created by people in recovery from alcoholism and addiction for people in recovery from alcoholism and addiction. This podcast is meant as a support tool for those in recovery. Everyone who participates in the podcast is in an active recovery program. We are not affiliated with any one recovery methodology, and will focus on a variety of different types of recovery, including 12-step recovery, otherwise known as Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous, Smart Recovery, Celebrate Recovery, Recovery Dharma, Cognitive Behavioral Therapy, and more. And a quick disclaimer, this podcast is intended to be informative. A podcast alone cannot support your sobriety and recovery, so we suggest it only as one component of a daily recovery routine. For more information on what recovery is, go to www.rehab.melbourne.
Awesome.
Hi, Ollie.
Hey, how's it going?
Not bad. How are you?
I'm actually not too bad. I'm finally over this loss of voice thing that I've been dealing with for the past little while. So that's good. And it sort of got me thinking, actually. Beautiful, smooth segue over into our topic for the day. Why was it that I lost my voice, and why was it that something happened like that when I really needed my voice to make these podcasts? Well, some people would say that it's God's will, which is just a big lol, because it's something that we have to negotiate in this podcast, that sometimes talking about the God thing is not the most beneficial thing for someone who's really early in recovery. I know there are people that come into recovery, and especially the 12-step fellowships and meetings, and they hear about and see this God stuff on the wall, or they hear other shares about it and things like that, and it just becomes something that is quite difficult to process, I think, in early recovery. So with that in mind, I think what we're going to do today, we're going to do the reading, which is on December the 4th, God's Will, Not Ours. And we're going to talk about it, or I'm going to talk about it from my perspective, which is really, I'm an NA guy. I subscribe to the 12-step stuff, and that doesn't necessarily mean that I blindly kind of accept it. I actually have a way of thinking about it that is quite realistic. I certainly came from a seriously agnostic and atheist viewpoint, and had to step into this God-centered or spirit. It's a spiritual thing. It's not religious. So although you have a higher power in the 12-step programs, it's actually, the way I see it, is purely practical. So enough of me blabbering on and trying to sort of perhaps soften the blow of this God thing. I'm just going to read the reading, and we'll talk about it after that. So December 4, God's will, not ours. We know that if we pray for God's will, we will receive what is best for us, regardless of what we think. Basic text, page 46. By the time we came to NA, our inner voices had become unreliable and self-destructive. Addiction had warped our desires, our interest, our sense of what was best for ourselves. That's why it's been so important in recovery to develop our belief in a power greater than ourselves, something that could provide saner, more reliable guidance than our own. We've begun learning to rely on this power's care and to trust the inner direction it provides us. As with all learning processes, it takes practice to pray only for knowledge of God's will for us and the power to carry that out. The selfish, ego-driven attitudes we developed in our addiction are not cast off overnight. Those attitudes may affect the way we pray. We may even find ourselves praying something like, "Relieve me of this character defect so I can look good." The more straightforward we are about our own ideas and desires, the easier it will be to distinguish between our own will and our higher power's will. Just for your information, God, we might pray, here's what I want in this situation. Nonetheless, I ask that your will, not mine, be done. That's my quoting accent, is for some reason American. Once we do this, we are prepared to recognize and accept our higher power's guidance. Just for today, higher power, I've learned to trust your guidance, yet I still have my own ideas of how I want to live my life. Let me share those ideas with you, and then let me clearly understand your will for me. In the end, let your will, not mine, be done. Quite wordy and a lot to unpack. What do you think?
A lot to unpack.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot to unpack.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, yeah. Do you have anything in particular to sort of, what did it make you think of, and how do you negotiate the higher power stuff in your recovery?
For me, it's still an area and a subject that I'm exploring and navigating. When I first came into recovery, I struggled with the concept of a higher power. And there were things that had happened in my life where I believed, like, how could that have happened to me and have been, God's intention for that to occur, and how can those things happen to other people and it be God's intention?
Absolutely.
So I had a little bit of a resentment, but I worked through that, and I now see God's will as, goodwill, to be honest. To have goodwill for myself, to have goodwill for other people, and to practice the principles of acceptance and surrender in, progress, not perfection, but in at least as many facets of my life as possible. I think I'm at a point now where I have more tolerance for hearing the word God in daily readings and that sort of thing. I do my best to look at the way that the words are used and interpret into the way that's, recovery has worked for me in my life. Like God's will is goodwill, and I go, out of my way to have goodwill in my life and to have goodwill in my affairs and to have goodwill in my intentions. So
yeah, and when you're running on that
an area,
well, it's something we all have to come to terms with, and I think when you're just purely acting in that goodwill for others and goodwill for you, and
I'm not
just
harming anyone, and I'm not harming myself, and that's crucial.
Not only that, but you're not running on your own will. Like for me, my will wouldn't necessarily always be goodwill. It would be benefit me ahead of everybody else and be reactive and harmful. And when I'm running on that goodwill or God's will or higher power's will, it just means that I'm not digging my own, demise. I really like that.
This is true.
Yeah. Well, I've got a whole bunch of notes here. And I think what it says is, we know that if we pray for God's will, we will receive what is best for us, regardless of what we think. And me being the cheeky person that I am, I said, we know that if we pray for God's will, we will receive whatever, we will receive, and it won't necessarily be what is best for us. We will get what we get, regardless of what we want. And that's literally the way I feel. I don't think it's necessarily God's will. I think it just is what it is. It is what it is. And the only thing I can control is how I react to it. So instead of thinking, instead of sitting in the position that I don't actually like and saying, oh, why me? And trying to twist everything to the way I want it to be, I just have to accept it and try and respond in a way that is spiritual, that aligns with this spiritual program that I'm trying to work in my recovery, that aligns with this strong recovery program that doesn't make my life dramatic and problematic the way it used to be. And you know what? When I'm doing that, then the option of putting a substance into my system it's not an option anymore, because my reality is not so unbearable that is the only option. And that used to be the only option for me. It was the only way I knew how to deal with life, was to numb myself so that I could survive, so that I could live day to day with things that were happening around me. I needed a chemical buffer because I couldn't deal with it. And in my notes here, I've got the reason we're addicts the reason, I can't say for other people, the reason I am a recovering addict, the reason why I went through those experiences was because I couldn't deal with life on life's terms. So the 12 steps and this recovery program that I work is purely practical, in that, of course, I tried to run my life for 26 years and I ended up completely broken, going into a rehab. And it was at that point that I realized, well, I'm going to have to try something different. And I learned that I am not necessarily the most functional and good at living my life person, and I needed to come to believe in something that could help me deal with life on life's terms. I don't necessarily look at, I lost my voice and say, oh, well, that's God's will. I just say, well, guess what, Oliver, you've lost your voice. Oh, that's silly, isn't it? Well, what are you going to do about it? I had to do maybe what God's will was, which was go and get some, go to the doctor and try and do something about it so that I could heal. That was literally all it was. What do you reckon? That's me talking for about 5 minutes straight.
I was all for it, though. It's okay.
Yeah, I'm just trying to unpack it, really, because I don't necessarily understand. I'm trying to sort of verbalize it, get it out there, and shape it into something that I can understand,
Yeah. So when I attempt to also understand what these sort of readings mean, for me, it just comes down to like surrendering to it. Which isn't that easy, to be honest. Like for me anyway, I do struggle a bit with surrendering to these sort of readings and being like, oh, okay, like I'm just gonna accept it for what it says, and see how it plays out. I try to be curious about this sort of thing as well, though, which is something that my sponsor has told me to do. And how, like, I'm a bit of a control freak, and I want everything to be contained and organized and taken care of so that I feel safe and I feel secure, and that's just not how it works out, like life on life's terms, sometimes things fall apart, and I've got to, be able to be flexible in that, because if I'm rigid, then I'm more likely to break. But if I'm flexible, then I'm going to find it easier to bend and sway,
I like that, bend and sway, like a reed in the wind,
Yeah,
Whereas I used to be like
adaptable.
Yeah, I used to be like a concrete, wall that would just get blown over by life.
Yeah.
And
yeah, that's right. I can relate.
I've written down here, everybody has the opportunity to work a program. Everybody has the opportunity to choose how they react to external stuff, whether it's God's will or it's just external stuff. You don't necessarily have to label it. So we'll talk a little bit about that after the break.
You're listening to the Recovery Cast by Hills and Rangers Private. Now playing daily on iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube. For more shows, visit us at www.rehab.melbourne.
Okay, so you're on the Recovery Cast with Oliver and Alexis, your hosts, and we are talking a little bit about the reading is God's will, and we're talking about, I don't think I want to name this episode God's Will. I think I'm going to call it Life on Life's Terms. I reckon that's a better way of saying it, that's not so sort of exclusive to the 12-step crowd, because no matter who you are and what you do, whether you're in recovery or not, everybody has their life that they are living, and everybody has to choose how they respond to the things that are happening in their life. don't you reckon?
Yeah, this is something that I've learned in recovery as well.
Mm.
I, let my life be really run by my emotions and my emotional responses, my reactivity and my impulsivity for an awfully long time. And recovery has taught me that I actually have a choice. I have a choice to respond with anger. I have a choice to respond with fear, and I have a choice to respond with empathy and compassion. And that doesn't mean that I can just make that choice and, magically I am actually experiencing those emotions or I'm finding it easy to do so. It does take practice, especially when you've been running on a certain narrative for a while.
Yeah.
And that's okay, but for me in this, the ability to choose how to respond, every choice has a consequence is something that I've learned, and I would much rather be able to hit that pause button prior to reacting.
Yeah.
And if I need to, sometimes I even employ the skill skill I learned in dialectical behavior therapy, which is using opposite action. And sometimes I may feel incredibly overwhelmed and upset by something, yet I will actively choose to respond in an opposite manner to how I am feeling, because otherwise, I can really lose control of myself in that moment, whether it's internally or not,
It's a pretty good...
So I'm pretty grateful for that one.
It's a pretty good method that I definitely could have employed in my early recovery, is whatever I wanted to do the exact opposite, and it's probably healthier. Don't you reckon?
It's a tricky one, but when it works, it's good.
It's hard. It's hard to do that, especially for me. I mean, in my life today, I'm not anesthetized by substances, so everything is raw and everything is real. And I think in early recovery it was particularly so. So I had to really employ some kind of I needed to use my recovery program to actually respond. And like you said, every action has consequences. And I think for so many years in my active addiction and my using, I was just living and dealing with all the negative consequences of my actions. There were no good consequences. There was very few. I was going through my life like just a bull in a china shop, creating all these issues. And what I've had to learn in recovery is that, maybe I actually did need some kind of a higher power, so that it was like a way of me learning not to do that. Because it was my default state. I actually had the default state of reacting in a controlling and angry way and creating these issues. What do you think?
Yeah, I can really relate to that. I'm still learning this one, to not react or respond in that default state, which did create issues, and then the issues that it created, I didn't want to be there, so I tried to control them even more, and it just creates and perpetuates a cycle. Yeah,
the cycle of disaster. And I think that's the difference. That's the difference between, someone who is living with, who is in recovery or who has experienced addiction or alcoholism, compared to, shall we say, someone who hasn't. So, shall we say a normal person, someone who doesn't have that experience, is that they probably know or have learned to respond in healthy ways. So it's that simple, it's practical. All that we're doing in recovery is we are learning to make those healthy decisions. And it's not our default state. It's not my default state. I would quickly go back to my old ways, because that's at the core of it. That's a big part of who I was, and it's still there. It has permeated every aspect of my personality to be controlling because of my experiences growing up, and genetics or whatever it is that makes me someone who I identify as an addict. I'm in recovery, but I still identify, and there's a reason why I identify that way. I identify that way so that I can treat it, so that there's actually something there that I can say, well, this is what it is. This is what's causing me pain in my life. This is what, even though I'm not actually addicted to substances anymore, I still have this personality that I need to treat. And the higher power thing is it's simply just a practical tool that I use to get out of myself and stop thinking that I'm running the show. And that has become incredibly transformative for me. And I can't hide that from someone who is in treatment or is seeking treatment. It is part of the solution to my problem. And my problem is me. You know, that is ultimately where it comes from. It's not the drugs or the alcohol. It's me. I am the reason why I use drugs and alcohol to make myself feel better, because I couldn't live with myself. I've talked about that. And for me, you know, my higher power is actually the thing that is at the core of my being, which is not... It's not Oliver, and it's not Oliver's hobbies, and it's not Oliver's dreams and desires and thoughts. It's just the thing that is aware of all those things. That's my higher power. And I think that consciousness that I'm talking about, it's not just the thing that is at the core of me. It's actually the thing that is at the core of everything. There's a lot of ways in which you can do the higher power thing. That's the way I have done it. Because of Eckhart Tolle, I found that. But look, you know, I always have a chuckle about people saying your higher power can be a doorknob, and I think that's just the most cringe thing to say. I always make fun of it, but the reality is, you know, not everybody's going to have a really strong concept of what a higher power is. Some people are in recovery for decades and they still don't know. And it's a God of our understanding. You don't even have to understand it. All you have to do is believe in it, that something is there. And I think that makes it kind of easier in a way for me, definitely. So yeah, whether it's goodwill, God's will, a doorknob, you know, the spirit of the universe, it's just something that's practical that we can put our faith in. And sometimes, I don't know, Alexis, I'm gonna tell a story about that. And the story is that I parked in a parking space and I got a parking ticket, and I called my sponsor up. I called someone who's in recovery, and I said, oh, I've actually, no, I'm not even going to say parking ticket because I'm making it up. I got a defect on my car. I drive a modified car. That's part of my hobby. One of my hobbies in recovery, and I got defected because the car was lowered and it was too low for Australian design rules. Now, I rang my sponsor almost in tears saying, I've got this canary, this yellow sticker saying defective vehicle on my windscreen. I was angry at the police. Why did they pick on me? You know, blah, blah, blah. And my sponsor said, well, who lowered the car? Did you drive over a bump and the suspension collapsed, or did you go out and buy lowered suspension? I said, I did it. And he said, right, okay, that's God's will and your will right there. You wanted to do that to your car, and God's will, or just the way things are, is that that's not legal, and you made the decision and now you have to live with it. What God's will is, I don't know what my God's will is. My God's will is just probably to do nothing. And, you know, that's an example of my will of running the show, of me controlling my car perhaps so that I could look good. I know it says in that, I don't know, it's definitely, you know, I have these ego things and I have to be different to everybody else because I'm special. You know, that's where I sort of, learned a little bit about how my will can be harmful to me, and that, you know, my higher powers will, or just the way of the universe, or whatever it is, life on life's terms, sometimes I have to do nothing and not modify that car and not do that. Maybe I have to think about what God's will would be. Sometimes I have to think about my behavior and that every action has a consequence. What do you think? Kind of specific.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
No, it's okay. It's specific.
Put myself in front of the mic.
Yeah, well,
yeah,
it's okay.
that was very specific. I I have to agree. I think you've summed up like really well, actually. Off the top of my head, I don't have any examples like that where I can think of God's will and
what about
my
the
will, like
in the previous episode, the interaction you had with a loved one that perhaps your will was involved, you know?
Okay,
you know?
we can do that.
Yeah, well,
My
I don't know.
will was
just
most certainly involved. And you know what? I can be a little more vulnerable about it. All it had to be was a conversation, a very calm conversation about something that had affected my boyfriend, and I just had to accept that and be mindful of that and hear him, and I chose to react and respond in a not very nice manner.
Is that Alexis's will versus...
That's Alexis's will
goodwill.
Versus goodwill, yes.
God's
very
will,
much
goodwill.
So. Sorry if
whatever.
you guys can hear my cat in the background. She's been very demanding today as well. She was just yelling at me. So.
The joys of recovery, is that we get...
Cat's yelling at you, yeah.
I didn't get clean to get yelled at by a cat, but I certainly got clean to have those things in my life, to have a pet and to be able to look after them. And I think... You know, like all this sort of really cryptic and deep stuff aside about higher powers and things, is that it's just a tool to remain in recovery, and there's a reason it's there, and it's not. They wouldn't put it in the 12 steps if it didn't work for you know, a huge majority of people, and you know what, everybody has the opportunity to work a program, and you can decide, listeners out there, you can decide whether you have a higher power, whether you choose to subscribe to that stuff or whether you don't. And you know what, if you've made the right choice, you know, you'll know, because if you haven't made the right choice, you'll be suffering and you might relapse. And if you have made the right choice, then, you know, your recovery might be a very different place. It might be smooth, and it might be like that reed in the wind, bending and flowing and going with the flow of what happens in life. So, yeah, thanks again, Alexis. Great having you as a host.
Thanks, Ollie.
No
Great to have
worries.
you too.
Thank you. All right, well, you've been listening to another episode of the Recovery Cast, proudly brought to you by Hills and Rangers Private. Any questions, any information that you need can be found at www.rehab.melbourne. And until then, whether you have a higher power or not, it's not super important. Just hold on to hope and have a lovely day. We'll see you soon.
Thank you for listening to the Recovery Cast. For more, visit us at www.rehab.melbourne.